Lovely to have you here in London, and thanks everybody for coming out this morning and for celebrating over these last few days many authors and some wonderful Words Fest activities that have taken place. It's great for London to be able to celebrate that. I wanted to just start, and I'll let you know too, we've got about an hour, but I'm going to also let you have time for questions. And you may have some things that you want to ask about the book that we're talking about today, or maybe on something else around Steve's political life. The one thing I already know is he said this is his last book. So maybe we can change his mind, because you never know. But I did want to ask you to start off. I read this book cover to cover, and it's really wonderful. And if you're a political junkie like I am, cover to cover, you read things that you maybe didn't even remember. It took you a long time to convince him to let you write about him, and you finally did. So tell us first how you got him to let you write about him.
Well, he's been out of public life for 31 years now, which is hard to imagine. But he has been. He retired in 1985, and it was not long thereafter that I started to get the idea that this man is a fairly consequential premier, right? I mean, he's the second longest serving premier in Ontario history. He had a front row seat for a lot of very important things. And I thought, well, someone should write a good book about him. And there was a book that came out in the late 1980s about him, written by Claire Hoy. I don't know if that name rings a bell. I see some people nodding their head. Claire was kind of, he was a small seat conservative who thought Bill Davis was a wet, if I can put it that way. Thought he was a very, not ideologically conservative enough for Claire Hoy. So the book, if I can quote Hobbes, was nasty, brutish, and short. And I just thought Bill Davis deserved a better book than that. But Mr. Davis did not cooperate with that book and was showing no interest in having his own story told. And went back to him numerous times over the years, and he would sort of tease me every now and then. I remember once reading a biography on Leslie Frost, premier before John Robarts, who everybody in this town would remember. And I said to him, this was a really good book. I mean, it's 450 pages long, and you're mentioned here, here, and here, and what do you think about this story? And he emailed me back and he said, Stephen, I think you'll agree that if we ever do this book project, my book will have to be longer than Leslie Frost's book because my premiership was longer than his. So I would get these little joking asides along the way. And finally, I think it was a few years ago, I said to him, the hints weren't working, Anne Marie, the hints weren't working. So eventually I said to him, look, you have a duty to history to share what you know. He got elected in 1959 for the first time. That's a long time ago. I said, you have a duty to history not to take all that information and all those stories with you to your grave. And beyond that, are you really going to give Claire Hoy the last word on your life? And that's what I said. And I think that might have nailed it, because the next day I got a call from his secretary saying, Mr. Davis will see you at his house tomorrow night. So went up there, made the pitch, and he finally said yes. And here we are.
Was the experience what you thought as you started out compared to all the research? Because it took quite a bit of time, and we're going to talk about some of the things about this a little bit later this morning, but was it what you thought it would be?
And more. It was first of all, he became premier when I was 10 years old, and he stayed premier until I was 24. So my most formative years, growing up in the province of Ontario, which actually started in London. I don't suppose any of you know that. There's no reason why you would. But I was born and raised in Hamilton, and I've lived more than 35 years in Toronto, but I was conceived in London. My parents were Western students, UWO students, as they used to call it then, and anyway, so it all sort of started here in London for me.
I didn't know that.
It was a real joy getting to spend as much time with him as I got to, both in Brampton and in Toronto. He's got a very nice modest little condo in Florida where we spent some time together. Got a cottage on Georgian Bay, we spent some time there. And, for a guy, I don't want to misconstrue this, it's not hero worship or anything like that, but obviously, my formative years growing up in the province were his most formative years as premier of the province. And so I respect and admire the man, and therefore the chance to spend that much time with him was terrific.
So you talked about your parents, but I want to talk about his parents for a minute. One of the things that you talk a lot about, and maybe this is a little bit of a political question for today's society as well, which you have some views on as well. Repeatedly through the book, you talk about the fact that his parents raised him to avoid the spotlight, to be moderate in all things. So you can imagine a premier who was here as long as he was, and when we talk about some of the things that occurred during his leadership, you might remember, you might not, like I did. Today, we're not moderate in all things, and I wonder if people could maybe take a lesson from the way that he provided the kind of leadership that he did.
Well, I think they should, but I'm not sure that it's in the cards. We're, as you point out, in a completely different time right now, where it is a lot about me, and I don't know if you've heard this, there's sort of a candidate running for the Republicans in the United States who's kind of the ultimate manifestation of that right now. And yeah, you're right, Bill Davis, I mean, his parents used to say, William, moderation in all things, and above all, be modest. And I think that's one of the reasons why it took so long for him to say yes to this book project, is that he somehow equated having a biography written about him as an immodest, portray of the facts of his life. And, that was problematic for him. There's another reason, which we may get into. We're going to talk about the first wife at all?
Yeah.
Bill Davis married his university sweetheart, whom he met at University of Toronto, and they had 4 kids very quickly. And then when she was about 31, she died and left him a widower with 4 kids under the age of 6. And I think another one of the reasons why he was not so quick to want to do this book project, or any book project, was that he knew that he would have to revisit that time of his life, which, as you can imagine, is not something that he necessarily would like to have done. But he did it. And he talks about her really at length for the first time that I can recall for this book. And it's funny, he still misses her, and he was the luckiest guy in the world to remarry somebody whom he had known from his cottage up on Georgian Bay since he was a kid. And she, Kathleen Davis, to whom he's been married for 50 years, has been phenomenal in the way that she took his 4 kids as if they were her own, and got his life organized, and let him do all the things in politics that without her he never would have been able to do. And she's not the slightest bit put off by the fact that there are pictures of the first wife in their cottage. There are grandchildren named after the first wife. Helen was her name. And she's a spectacular person to have been able to be confident enough in her own place, in his world and his family, and yet still find time for this woman whom she knew from, of course, the Georgian Bay days, whom she knew. She's amazing, Kathy Davis. She really is.
And they also had another child together, so there was one more to add to the brood. And
5 altogether.
Yeah, so that really was. But I think it's a question too, as you look at some of the tough issues that he had to deal with, knowing that about his life, knowing that about the support that he had with his wife and his children, who none of them are in the spotlight at all, never really were, always strayed away from it. And yet he could be feisty at times, and he could be competitive at times, but that wasn't his typical leadership. How did you find him in terms of the leadership, and then seeing him in person writing a book about him?
He's such a fascinating combination of modesty, but ego. You don't win a leadership convention, and you don't participate in, I can't remember off the top of my head now, maybe 8 elections, if you're going back to MPP and Premier. And get to the top of the greasy pole if you don't have an ego. So let there be no mistake, he's got an ego. Keeps it in check very well. He didn't, I think, want this to get out, but I sort of got it out of him anyway. He did grade 13 twice. Not because he flunked, but because he was a quarterback of the football team and was supremely competitive. And they didn't have a great season his first year, so he came back to grade 13 again, so he could have a better season competitively in football. Lots of examples along the way of how he's an extremely competitive sort, and anybody who's been around these parts long enough to remember the 1975 election, during which he and Bob Nixon went after each other in that debate, the then Liberal leader, which makes the Trump-Clinton debates look like a cakewalk. I mean, they were screaming at each other. It was so brutal. And yet, his governing style was to sit back and listen. He was a great listener. And when his cabinet ministers were debating an issue, or when his advisors were debating an issue, he would sit back, chew on that pipe, and just listen. And I guess he discovered early on in the game that if he betrayed what his position was going in, it would affect the quality of the debate that would take place, because people, wouldn't necessarily want to get on the wrong side of it, and therefore he felt he wouldn't necessarily get the most honest advice. So he'd sit back there just like a sphinx, not betraying his position on anything, and as a result got really good advice most of the time, and was able to make good decisions most of the time. Not all the time, nobody gets them all right, but more often than not, he got it right.
So the thing, again, I said this to you, this was a who's who of people. Because it goes back so far, people that we know today, for an example, John Tory, who is the mayor in Toronto, was a young PC student looking to get involved in a career. Pierre Trudeau, Robarts, Mike Harris, Ernie Eves, even Hurricane Hazel, who is someone that I worked with, and she was in politics for such a long time. It must have been incredible when you started to do the research and you went all the way back to see all of these people who had some influence or some ability to do something with them, but then have gone on to do things for themselves.
It really is. And there are funny stories associated with all of them. Like John Tory first became a Tory when he was 14. And he went to the leadership convention in 1971 at Maple Leaf Gardens that Bill Davis won, but he supported Davis's opponent. Now that's really strange, considering that he considers Bill Davis like a second father to him, and Bill Davis considers John Tory like the sixth child. But it didn't start as a supportive relationship. John Tory was there to help elect Alan Lawrence, who was his chief competitor. Same with Mississauga, with Hazel McCallion, whom you know. I think, Bill Davis put in place the regional governments that at the time were outrageously controversial, and which today everybody, of course, takes for granted, and we can't imagine going back to, 7 different municipalities in Peel region, or 6 different municipalities in Hamilton Wentworth, where I'm from. It just wouldn't happen. And Hazel McCallion was a terrible holdout for municipal government. She wanted Streetsville to be a distinct society on its own, and not part of, the new megacity of Mississauga. And yet, look what happened to her. She becomes the longest serving mayor in the history of the country. Maybe in the history of the British Commonwealth, I think, actually. I think she was. I think she's mayor for 32 years or something.
Well, she's still kicking, too. I'm not there. She's like 94 now. She's just been retired a few years.
Yeah. So all of these ironies abound, where Bill Davis made various decisions that lots of people had problems with, and then, they end up doing just fine. Thank you very much.
So some of the things that were achievements in his time, you may remember some of these, but I was surprised about some of them, didn't know about them. So I'm going to just name a couple of them, but then your thoughts on maybe what you think some of his or the achievement is. The college system, which I'm proud to work in. We're going to be celebrating 50 years of the college system in Ontario. He started that. He was a real proponent of education, so the increase in teachers, so really understanding the importance of having teachers in smaller class sizes. Changing the age of majority, voting, drinking, implementing the first lottery corporation. Any lottery people in here? You can thank him for Ontario way back then. Margaret Birch, the first female cabinet minister. Can you imagine? I mean, for us these days, and there's lots of talk because of what's happening in the States, but very first time there was ever a female in cabinet was during his time. First jurisdiction in Ontario to require drivers to wear seatbelts. Something we take for granted today. Lots of things here.
Let me pick up on the last one, because that's a London connection as well, I think. You have to wear your seatbelt when you drive a car or a truck in the province of Ontario today, because one of Bill Davis's closest advisors, a lawyer from Toronto named Eddie Goodman, had a daughter who went to Western. And one day, she was driving back along the 401 from Western to Toronto to come home. And she got into a car accident and was thrown from the vehicle and died. And she was, 18, 19, 20 years old. And Eddie Goodman then decided that it was going to be his mission in life to prevent this kind of carnage on the highways henceforth. And he lobbied Bill Davis a lot. And eventually, Ontario became, as you point out, I think the first jurisdiction in all of Canada to require mandatory seatbelts. Now, I remember when this happened. I think I was a teenager at the time. And I remember everybody complaining about it, saying, how can you impinge on my personal freedom by requiring me to wear a seatbelt? They didn't seem to mind that the healthcare system that we were all paying money into, my taxes would have to go to cleaning up your accidents. They didn't seem to mind that anomaly. It was a big issue of personal freedom. But eventually, it got through. And now, 40 years later, we do it all the time. We don't even think about it. But this is a list of not bad achievements. The granddaddy of them all is not on the list. I'll leave that for you to bring up later, I guess. But yeah, in the 1960s, Bill Davis was John Robarts' education minister, and he was in charge of 40% of the budget. Education back then was like health today. They had all the money. They built the entire community college system. They started 5 or 6 new universities. We got OISE, Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, at U of T. We got TVO. Bill Davis always likes to tease me, saying if I hadn't created TVO, you'd have been unemployed the last 20 years. I've never argued with him because I fear he might be right. But anyway, it's not a bad list of achievements as you look at it.
We'll talk about some other ones too.
Okay.
But it was a few years or a few elections before he actually got a majority government. He had to go from minority to minority for the first couple anyway. And I think when he, in one of those elections, even lost seats, more seats than, even though they won, they still had lost seats. And it was kind of a humbling experience, it seemed, for him. Going back to almost what his mother and father used to tell him, but, once you kind of get slapped in politics, you got to remember those things.
He always had campaigning didn't necessarily come easily to him because he was a modest guy. He could never use the first person pronoun. He never said, I'm going to do this for you and I'm going to do this for you. It was always we. And even when he was talking about himself, he said we. It was almost a Victorian royal we. But he inherited the leadership from Robarts, and his first election in 1971, actually 45 years ago, 21st of October, so we're not even a month removed from the 45th anniversary of his first win. And his first election victory was a solid one. He improved on the majority that Robarts had. But you're quite right. Right after that, he got slapped down bad with a minority government in 75, and then another minority government in 77. And I think the great revelation for him in 77 was, they don't quite trust me enough yet to give me, the keys to the car entirely on my own. And he resolved at that point, in 1977, having won a second consecutive minority government, that he was going to serve the whole 4 years with the cooperation of the opposition. And I talked to opposition politicians for the book who say Ontario was genuinely never more democratic than it was from 1977 to 81. And there are people in this room, I'm sure, who were there. I saw George Hutchison earlier, who would have been there covering it for the London Free Press and then afterwards for David Peterson as his press secretary. And there was something about Davis's ability, again, not as a hard right-wing ideologue, but as a pragmatic progressive conservative, that allowed him, on some issues, to tack left, to get the NDP support on bills, to tack right, to get the Liberal Party support on other bills. And, there was a collegiality in the legislature at the time that developed. I'm not saying it wasn't, brass knuckles politics and it wasn't tough, but there was a collegiality at the time. And I think the best example proving that is that when Brian Mulroney, when he was Prime Minister, called Bill Davis in 1984 and said, I need a UN ambassador, who would you recommend? Bill Davis recommended the leader of the NDP from those minority government years. I mean, can you imagine that happening nowadays?
Do you remember Stephen Lewis?
I mean, it's impossible for me to imagine Stephen Harper recommending Thomas Mulcair for any job. I'm not taking a shot at anybody here. I'm just saying that we're in a different era. I mean, they do not have the relationships today that they had back then. And that's the best example of it. And Stephen Lewis and Bill Davis are best pals to this day. Stephen Lewis has got this foundation where he travels all around the world on AIDS awareness and AIDS relief, and Bill Davis has answered the call every time when it came to attending fundraisers, giving speeches at fundraisers, doing whatever he wanted. And I like that. You know, I like that. I don't want to sound like a fuddy-duddy here saying it was always better in the old days, but that was better. Those kinds of inter-party relationships were better in the old days. I think we need to get back to some of that.
But he actually says that to you in the book, that he doesn't understand why, you know, they are the way they are now compared to back then, even though they might have their feisty conversations and back and forth and whatever. It wasn't a personal thing.
Right.
Whereas I think now it's a little different, and he even laments that a little bit because he's still very involved.
I think the most concrete example I saw of this was, I think 3 or 4 years ago. He was the guest of honor. We have a gala dinner every year at TVO to help raise some money, keep the lights on. And he was our honoree. And in the audience at the time were Premier Kathleen Wynne and the then opposition leader Tim Hudak. And Mr. Davis got up there and he gave a speech saying all the things you would expect him to say about TVO and how he created it and all the good educational initiatives it had done over the years. And then he looked at the two of them in the audience and he said, "Now, I don't want to get involved in partisan politics here, but you two need to respect each other a little more." and he said, and then he said basically what I said, you know, back in our day we could beat each other up over question period, but then we'd go out for dinner afterwards and it was more collegial. And he said, you know, we all got elected in our different parties with our different views, but all to come to Queen's Park and do the public's business. And I respected the fact, Davis said, that not everybody is going to be a progressive conservative, but Liberals and New Democrats got elected too, and I had to respect that fact and play ball with them. And he said, now you two need to do that as well. Boy, did that fall on deaf ears, because not too long after that, Tim Hudak accused, well, he slandered the Premier. He slandered and libeled the Premier, and she sued him for $2 million, and it just, the whole thing fell right into the crapper, as they say. So, but I think he's right. I think we need to get back to that.
One of the other things that he seemed to have sort of an uncanny ability is that even though he had all these advisors and people that could kind of keep their ear to the ground, he always knew way before they even came to him that anything on an issue. So, you know, you talk about an example where his young advisor was going to be coming in to tell him something really hard that he needed to tell him. He already knew all about it. And he seemed to have that ability. Are those the kind of instincts that you saw prevalent throughout his career, and are we missing that today too?
It's partly instinct, and it's partly the fact that, you remember, as education minister in the 60s, they built like never before, and not since. So it was not unusual for Bill Davis to travel all over the province and open 3 new schools every day. And as a result, he knew everybody everywhere. You know, I mean, when he went to Kenora to open a new school, he knew who the head of the Progressive Conservative Association was. He knew who the mayor was. You know, he knew it. He just knew everybody. And, you know, as a result, yes, when John Tory walked into that office that day, ready to spill the beans on some great secret that he had just discovered, and yeah, Bill Davis knew about it already, because Bill Davis has got his tentacles all over the province. He knows people. I mean, he had the same thing with Bob Ray. Bob Ray, when he was Premier, I think, called him up to ask for his advice on something. And, you know, Davis knew it already. He knew what the call was going to be about. Yeah, that comes from listening. That comes from getting around the province. That comes from not thinking that you have all the answers. Pretty good qualities.
Yeah. So let's turn to one of the important issues during his time, more about Canada than Ontario, but affected the whole country, which was constitutional reform by then Prime Minister Trudeau. You might recall that occurred back in the early 80s, and there was one really controversial thing that was holding this up from each of the different provinces, and that was the notwithstanding clause. It was controversial. We had provinces fighting. Ontario didn't want to have any part of this. But there is one really important factor about what happened to make this all happen that no one knew about, and I'm not even sure you can even tell us a lot about it, because it's the phone call.
It's the phone call.
It's
You're
the
right.
phone call that nobody can really tell you about, because he's the only one that's really alive left. So, a day before everything came to be, Premier Davis called the Prime Minister. What did he talk about?
20 seconds of background here for those of you who are too young to remember all this, because it's 1981 we're going back to right now. Pierre Trudeau has decided that in his final term he wants to repatriate the Constitution of the country, which you'll remember was just we are an act of the British Parliament. That was our Constitution. And he wanted a Charter of Rights and Freedoms as well, so that people's human and civil rights would be, in his view, better protected. And when he put his ideas out there, two premiers supported him. Richard Hatfield from New Brunswick and Bill Davis from Ontario. That was it. There was this quote-unquote gang of 8 who opposed the entire initiative. Bill Davis, in the spirit of John Robarts, in the spirit of Leslie Frost, it is a classic Ontario premier's job to try to play middleman and bring everybody together here. And he tried to do that. And he would, there's a lot of shuttle diplomacy. And it got to the point where both sides were just heels dug in, no movement, the whole thing was going to fall apart. And he really did not want this to happen again. Because 10 years earlier, when he just got sworn in as premier, a couple of months after he was sworn in as premier, he and the other first ministers went to Victoria, BC, and they got an agreement. They got unanimity on constitutional renewal. But by the time Robert Bourassa got back to Quebec, the whole thing started to fall apart, and Bourassa thought, I can't sell this, and it never happened. And Davis was adamant this is not going to happen again. So, this notwithstanding clause, which is kind of the out clause in our Constitution, meaning that if the Supreme Court makes a decision that the Parliament or the legislatures don't like, they can invoke this notwithstanding clause, saying, notwithstanding all the rights that people have in the Charter of Rights, we're going to opt out of this and we're going our own way. It's what they call, I guess, a safety valve, so that we don't have, never mind the tyranny of Parliament, but the tyranny of courts. It's a classic Canadian compromise. Trudeau didn't want it. He wanted the courts to be able to have supremacy over Parliament because he thought parliamentarians didn't do the best job at securing people's civil rights. But Bill Davis saw the writing on the wall, and he called the Prime Minister that night, and obviously a phone call that has never been discussed because he won't brag about it, and it was like pulling teeth to get this story out of him. He calls the Prime Minister one night and he says, I said, was it an ultimatum? He said, absolutely not an ultimatum. It was a suggestion. But the suggestion was, Prime Minister Trudeau, if you don't yield on this notwithstanding clause, you're going to lose me. And Bill Davis could not go to the British Parliament with the Premier of New Brunswick and 9 other premiers against him and say, please repatriate our Constitution. That was a non-starter. So Trudeau compromised. He put the biggest amount of water in his wine, and we have today, probably as a result, the most admired political achievement, except for Confederation, I would say, in the history of the country. I mean, that repatriation and the Charter of Rights was a grand accomplishment. It wasn't perfect. Quebec didn't sign on. There were absences of rights in that deal that some would say needed fixing over the years and haven't yet been fixed. But considering how hard this country is to govern, it was a pretty good agreement. And I don't think it happens without Bill Davis. And I tell the story in the book for the first time.
And he gets no credit.
No, and you know what? He insists, because he's a modest guy, I don't know if I've mentioned that, but he insists that on the day, I think it was April 17th, 82, they're on the front lawn of Parliament Hill, and there's the Queen, and there's Pierre Trudeau, and Jean Chrétien, the Justice Minister, and Michael Field, the Clerk of the Privy Council, and all the federal dignitaries are standing, or sitting, I guess, at a table as the Queen signs the document under a tent, because it's pouring rain, and all the premiers are sitting in the audience getting rained on. And that, Bill Davis says he didn't mind that so much, but, to me, it was a team achievement. And the fact that the premiers would be sitting there getting rained on while the cameras were all gloriously covering all the federal Liberal politicians, they might have revisited that one.
So one of the other issues that really spanned his whole career, but he really didn't do anything about it till the end of his career, was the issue of full funding for Catholic schools. I don't know how many of you remember, but I remember having to pay to go to school when I went to high school.
We did.
I did. I had to pay not for grade 9 and 10, but for grades 11, 12, and 13, because I chose, as our family chose, to go to Catholic school. And through each one of the elections, it kept coming up, And there was a lot of controversy again about that within his party, within the province itself. And it wasn't really until he was on his way out and had announced that he was going to be retiring that he decided the time was right.
Julie, there she is. Julie, you and I talked about this before we even started. Julie is not a Catholic, but she taught in the Catholic school system. I'm outing you here, okay? You taught in the Catholic school system, and you were told,
keep it quiet.
Keep it quiet, yeah. To me, without question, it's the most controversial file that was ever on his desk. When he took over the leadership of the PC party in February 1971, John Robarts sort of jokingly said to him, "I've taken care of everything, Billy." He was one of the two people in the world who could call him Billy, his wife being the other. "I've taken care of everything, Billy. I've only left you two minor files, the Spadina Expressway and the Bishop's Brief." You know? The two biggest stink bombs in Ontario political history. Bill Davis won the 1971 election because he refused to extend full funding to the separate school system. And in what was then a much more Protestant, orange Ontario, they, and his base in particular, loved that. But he didn't. I think, based on conversations with his friends and with him, I think he always felt a little bit guilty about the fact that he won such a big majority in 71 on the backs, if you like, of separate school supporters like your family. And for 13 years, I think that gnawed at him a little bit. And so he retired in October of 1984, announced his retirement. 3 months before that, he got up in the legislature and announced that he was reversing his decision of 13 years earlier and would go forward with a plan to extend full public funding to the separate school system. And here we are, it's 32 years later, and I think there's still lots of people in the province who have not yet come to terms with this decision, or who still think it was a bad decision. And I myself waver on it. I have a daughter in the separate school system. On the other hand, the United Nations has kind of slapped our wrists for having one fully funded school system for Catholics, two for Catholics, but only one for everybody else. So it's one of the very interesting anomalies that is all part of our history, part of the grand bargain of 1867. And of course, the irony is he retired before he had a chance to actually implement what he set out to do. But given that the Peterson-led Liberals and the Bob Rae-led New Democrats agreed with it, they made it happen. But he's the guy who reversed himself 13 years later in one of the most astonishing volte-faces, as they call it, probably in history.
Well, I was going to mention that it did take, again, in his mind, the cooperation of all three parties, because he was gone anyway, for Peterson and Rae. When he introduced it 3 months before he left, they agreed with him. So It was kind of calm. I think people in his own party disagreed more than the opposition parties might have.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. In fact, there was 130 members of the legislature back then, and one person voted against it. And it was a cabinet minister of his, a guy named Norm Sterling from Eastern Ontario. And Mr. Davis loves saying this. Every time he sees Norm Sterling, he says to him, "That was a very courageous vote of yours to go against your cabinet and your government, Norman. And I notice I still don't have your resignation letter over that. So I'll keep waiting for it, it's okay." He would tease him, he'd sort of tease him over the years that yes, Norm felt very strongly about opposing his government on that one. Not so strongly that he felt he had to resign over it, but strongly.
So I have a few more questions, and then we'll turn it over to you because we've got about 15 minutes left before the next aspect of the Words Fest comes. I know. So one of the things that I found interesting, but you would a lot more than I would have, the archive of letters.
Yeah.
So it never occurred to me in my career to keep all those letters after a certain period of time. I did for a little while. You get nice ketters and other things like that, but he kept them. And now they're in the archives of Ontario, and you had a chance to go through those letters. They must have been just, extraordinary to go through.
For a nerd like me, it was a treasure trove. It was just great. The thing that I think makes this book different than certainly Claire Hoy's book, but any other book that could have been done now, is that Mr. Davis did give me access to his archives, which are kept at the archives in Ontario at York University, and he kept everything. Every letter he ever got is there. Every letter he ever wrote, they carbon copied it and kept a copy of that as well. There are some wonderful, just wonderful, beautiful letters. Two come to mind immediately. Stephen Lewis wrote him a beautiful letter after he announced his retirement. Stephen Lewis was in Africa at the time doing his work, and wrote the most glowing, lovely fan letter, is the only way to describe it, congratulating him on a great career. There's a resignation letter from Frank Miller in there that Mr. Davis kept but never accepted, because he and Frank had some real disagreements on serious things. Frank was a common sense revolutionary. Bill Davis bought an oil company. Frank Miller didn't think the government had any business buying private oil companies. Suncor, you may remember this, in the early 1980s. So yes, there are lots of lovely letters there, and he gave me access to it all. It all eventually will be opened up to the public, but not for another 15 years, I think. So the fact that I could get access to it now, that's why this is sort of an authorized biography, but he didn't see the manuscript before it was published, and he had no input into the editorial decisions that were made. And I think he understood that the book would have more credibility if it wasn't sort of ghostwritten for him, but rather, I remember sitting in his den, he said, "Stephen, it's your book, you write it the way you want," when he finally agreed to do it. So he gave me the material, and off to the races I went.
So has he read it now, and what did he say?
I don't think he has read it yet. It's a funny thing. He's a very busy guy actually still, and I think he's waiting for a time, maybe over the Christmas holiday. You know what? Like Bill Davis lived his life this way: never put off till tomorrow what you can avoid doing altogether. And he ran his government that way. And I think he's sort of waiting. I think he wants to let it sit a bit. I think he wants to hear back from his friends on what they thought of it. And I think he wants to wait sort of for Christmas week, where he's going to get a whole, couple of weeks without any disturbances, where he can just sit down and devour the whole thing. I know lots of other people who've read it in the meantime, and, I don't think he has anything to be embarrassed about.
I know, it's a great book. So, last thing, uncommon love for people. Is that the bottom line about his success and why he has had so many people from all stripes? And even today, people are still calling him, asking for advice. Mayor Jeffrey, more recently, and others, his advice never seems to be old.
The Premier and he speak frequently. He always jokes that I am here to be a resource and to be a support for whoever the Premier is of the day, including this one, until 6 months before the next election, when he becomes a partisan Tory again. And at that point, the advice will stop. Bill Davis loves people. You can tell he loves people. When he goes to public events, he can't help himself. That's why he got into the game. He got into the game to be of service to people. I remember him telling me the story about when Margaret Thatcher and he met at Queen's Park. She was over here for a G7 conference or something, and did a courtesy call with him. And she said to him, "Do you know why I love being Prime Minister so much?" And he said, "Well, I assume it's for the same reasons that I enjoy being the Premier. It's a chance to serve and give back and so on." She said, "No, Premier. I love being Prime Minister because how else could a woman like me enjoy so much power?" Now that tells you a lot about somebody. The word power was banned in the Davis government. You were not allowed to use that word. We're not here to wield power. We're here to serve the public. And I don't think it was lip service with him. I think he was the embodiment of it.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. We have some time for questions, if there are those, and I think you're going to help us with the microphone.
This one here. And we started a little later, so if we have more time for questions, if people have them.
I've been involved with the Progressive Conservative Party up to the point of Mr. Harris. So I was there very young, but still watching things that way. And I've always sensed that there's kind of been a bit of a vacuum in that party ever since Mr. Davis left. So I'm just wondering, what do you think caused the Progressive Conservatives to not quite reach that same level again?
Well, Davis's genius, you have to remember, was that he understood that most Ontarians are not ideological. They are, excuse me, they are pragmatic people who occupy the broad center of the political spectrum. And he owned that. In fact, the whole PC party owned it for 42 straight years, right? From 1943 to 85. They owned it. And then after Mr. Davis left, the party chose Frank Miller. And Frank Miller made no bones about it. He was he was an admirer of Ronald Reagan's and Margaret Thatcher's, and he wanted to bring the party much further to the right, which he did. And when he did that, a premier from this city, well, he wasn't premier yet, but the Liberal leader from this city jumped right into the middle of the political spectrum and said, oh, you're going to leave the middle? Okay, I'm very happy being here. And David Peterson jumped into that area, and in the next election in 1985, he won the most votes. And you know the story about how he combined with Bob Rae and they threw the Tories out, and that was that. Now, once you've vacated the center of the political spectrum, from which you can build an increasingly larger tent, it's real hard to get back there. Because, of course, for you to get back there, the other person has to go out of there. And for the longest time, that area has been occupied. Now, we've seen, I think, you can argue with me, this is my thesis, but I think probably Bob Rae moved the political spectrum too far to the left. I think maybe David Peterson did a little bit as well. And so when Mike Harris came in, I'm not sure that was Ontarians embracing their inner common sense revolutionary. I think that was an attempt to sort of drag the center of the political spectrum from over here back to here. I think that explains his victories. And then, as we've seen more latterly, Kathleen Wynne's taking, I think, a fairly bold gamble by moving the center of the political spectrum further to the left again. And we will see in June 7, 2018, we will see whether or not that has paid off, because we're already seeing the signs of Patrick Brown, the current PC party leader, trying to move his party away from where Tim Hudak had it, way over in the right, and nudge it more over into the middle. Now, that's a tough job for every Conservative Party leader to do, because you've got a mostly rural, mostly small C Conservative constituency that is very comfortable and happy over here and doesn't like moving into the middle. So we'll see if he can pull it off.
And even Premier Davis, as loyal as he is to his party, did not, I think, appreciate how far right Mike Harris or Ernie Eves tried to be, because that really set the province. Well, I was mayor at that time. I was on council during some of those times, and it went so extreme. It was like they were mean. And I think he felt that way too. It was just a little too extreme for the way his own leadership was.
He will not like me saying this, so I'll say it. He was not a huge fan of Mike Harris, and he was not a huge fan of Stephen Harper. In the case of Stephen Harper, he didn't think Harper liked people, and for him, that was a non-starter. In the case of Mike Harris, he felt that Mike Harris demonized teachers too much. Mr. Davis loves teachers. He loves education. Almost everyone in his family has gone into education somehow, either as a teacher or setting up educational foundations or studying at OISE or studying education in university. It's in their blood. And I think that he and Mike Harris got offside from each other, which is ironic because Harris won his first election in '81 running as a Bill Davis conservative. But then, they parted their ways, and they're civil to each other. Don't get me wrong, and I'm sure Bill Davis voted for Mike Harris. I know he did. He's never voted anything other than conservative his whole life. But I think he thought that Mr. Harris was sort of needlessly provocative in a way that Mr. Davis would say he wasn't. Although he was from time to time, the record should say.
Questions?
This question is more about you and us as people in Canada. You said of yourself that you are a bit of a nerd, and other people have called you a Boy Scout and things like that. But I think that
I didn't read that either.
but I think that when that sort of name calling, when you self-identify that way and people identify you in those sorts of camps, I think it's a good thing, because it means that everybody in the room is in some way connected to you, because we are all a bit nerdy and we're all a bit Boy Scouting. I think that's kind of the Canadian thing. So when you make that a strong thing by doing it so publicly, I think you give everybody the chance to do it as well. And I wanted you to say thank you for that sort of way of being. And what I also want to say is that we need to be more proud of the fact that we are just rough on the edges and do what we do the way we do it because we are who we are. And I wanted to ask you how you gain the strength to continue doing that all the time.
That's a very interesting question. I've never been asked that before. How does one answer that? I have been blessed, I think, with two things in life. I have fantastic parents who are still around and who are wonderful role models for me in every way. And I happen to be blessed with a lot of curiosity about how the world works. And I think that's served me well for whatever I've been able to do in this so-called career of mine. I'm deeply, deeply interested in how the world works. And I think that's sort of propelled everything. That's why I've written 7 books. That's why I do the show I do. That sort of underpins everything. I don't pretend for a second. It's funny, I've been kind of covering Queen's Park for 30 years. I mean, that's you know how you sort of just show up for work every day and then suddenly you realize, oh my goodness, I've been sort of covering this stuff for 30 years. And I think the only thing I'm smart enough to know is that I know about 10% of what's going on down there. And knowing that I know almost nothing about what's going on down there really motivates me to keep trying to figure it all out. So thank you for that very interesting question, which made me have to look into my soul more than I really wanted to. I'm very uncomfortable right now.
John?
Yes, sir.
I want to talk about you, or you as well, but about your show.
Oh God, not again.
I'm sure you've noticed there are not many shows anywhere in North America where actually there is intelligent discussion on an objective basis with people who respect the personalities and the individuals they're discussing with. You know, your show criticizes ideas, never individuals. And I think as a result, far more is accomplished and far more is learned. So, my concern as you age, is that you? Is that the show's production? Is that TVO? Will we see it continue? Because we sure don't see it in the U.S.
Well, let me get up from my rocking chair here. The answer to your question is yes, all of the above. It's not a coincidence that I work at TVO. I was a donor to TVO before I started working there. I thought the place was distinctive and unique and did good work that nobody else was doing. So I gave them money before I started working there. I think there's a mission about the place that doesn't exist anywhere else on the broadcast landscape. I don't criticize private television for this. Everybody's got their own particular purpose in life. But you know, at the end of the day, their purpose is to deliver eyeballs to advertisers. And that's fine. You know, that's what it's about for them. That's not what it's about for us. What it's about for us is to deal with the citizens of the province as citizens on a range of issues that are important at this dawn of the 21st century and give smart people a chance to come in and debate and engage on them. And that's what we do. And we're a very kind of mission-driven place in that regard. We want to do it on television. We want to do it online. You know, on our websites, on our, you know what? We don't care where you enjoy our stuff, whether it's on TV or on your computer or on your, you know, handheld device or whatever. But our mission is different. I'll tell you a little story about that, which absolutely blew me away. We used to do a show called Studio 2. And it lasted for 12 years, and it was, I loved doing it. It was great. But we had new management come in. Lisa DeWild, who is our current CEO, has been there since 2005, I think. And after she took over, one of the first things she did was cancel Studio 2, which initially not a lot of people were very happy about. And we had an all-staff meeting, I think a few hundred people in the room, and somebody got up and asked what I thought was a very gutsy question, which was, what size audience will this new, still unnamed show have to get for it to fulfill its mandate? And she gave an answer which you would never hear any other executive in broadcasting give anywhere in North America. She said, we will not judge the success or failure of this new show by the size of its audience, but by whether it fulfills its mission. Namely, a place to discuss the big issues of the day. And oh my goodness, that so gratified me, because now you can't have nobody watching. And I'm sorry to take a shot at the CBC here, but I'm gonna. But they've had vice presidents in place in the past who said, if you don't get 1 million viewers, you're out the door. Well, that's private television's mandate. Private television is in the business of ensuring that we get 1 million viewers or you're canceled. Public television is supposed to have a different mandate. And so to hear that really warmed my heart. And I think we've been, that's the mission of the place, that's the mission of the people who work at the place, that's my personal mission, as it has been for the 24 years that I've worked there. So I think once I go to my dotage, the place will still be in good hands. That's my heart.
A great place for us to end our session today. The book is called Bill Davis, Nation Builder and Not So Bland After All. Steve has copies here that he is willing to sign and sell and make a few bucks. And of course, I'm going to get him to sign mine first.
Dunn's going to make the money, not me. Don't worry. No.
But please join me in congratulating him on yet another successful book, and thank you
And a hand for Anne Marie for doing